A very good evening to all of you. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Atisha Mathur today. Atisha, before I give a formal introduction, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
How old were you in 1987?
Two.
Two? So that was the first time when your parents brought you to my house. So I have known you since you were 2 years old.
Yeah.
Okay? So you can calculate how old he is. And he just got his
39.
his doctoral degree.
Yeah.
And I'm really very happy to have you at the center. You know, when I joined Tushita, your dad was the director, Mr. Naresh Mathur of Tushita Center. So we are carrying on with the legacy. And it's really great to see you here as a teacher today. Yeah. So Dr. Atisha Mathur was born and brought up in New Delhi, India. He pursued his undergraduate studies in language and literature of South Asia with a focus on Tibetan studies at the esteemed Orientale in Naples, Italy. His scholarly pursuits led him to the Central University of Tibetan Studies in Sarnath, India, where he was first immersed in the traditional approach to Buddhist studies. Atisha subsequently completed a rigorous 10-year study program at the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics in Dharamsala. In 2024, he earned his doctoral degree in Buddhist studies at Orientale in Naples. Since 2019, Atisha has generously shared his expertise in logic and debate with groups of students from all over the world. Today, Atisha is going to speak on Is Dharma a Hobby? Actually, it is something to do with the relevance of Buddhism. So I request you to please enlighten all of us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renukaji. I think I met you when I was 2, but before that, I think Tushita is the first place I came to when I left the hospital. Yeah, I mean, that's what my parents tell me. When we left the hospital, the first place we came to was Tushita, which I think was which one now? I don't remember anymore. 85 it would have been.
85 was Sheikh Sarai.
Sheikh Sarai, yeah, that sounds more right. Yeah, Sheikh Sarai. So thank you. And I have to give the premise that I've never been this nervous. We do classes online and other places, but Tushita is possibly the most nerve-wracking because it has a lot of, I guess, emotional connections, and it's the place that I've been in the most. And I've always been on that side of the fence. So now having to be on this side of the fence, along with it being Delhi and along with it being Tushita and seeing people who I've grown up around, is a little more nerve-wracking than otherwise. You know, when you don't know the situation, you don't know many people, then you can feign ignorance. I can't do that here. But there's also the home court. I feel like this is my house. I really feel like this is home. So if I take a few liberties that I will not take elsewhere, it's because there's a comfort that comes with being at home and understanding the references of the people who live here and people who think like us. So that's why I might take a few liberties that I won't take elsewhere. The subject, that the kind of the title, is Dharma a Hobby? It came up in discussion with Nico. And I think it's also relevant because the reason why I think it's relevant and why I think Nico also kind of suggested something along this line, even though then I picked the title, is because especially in a center, which is a city center, and especially in a metropolitan city like Delhi or otherwise, there is a certain dynamic and there is a certain way of thinking and a certain approach that is unique and is not necessarily the same as centers where people need to take time out of their lives to go there, sit there, concentrate and focus, right? There's a lot going on. And in the midst of that, then you approach a spiritual tradition or a philosophical tradition, whatever you want to call it. And so in a place like Delhi in 2025, which is not the Delhi when we were younger, when there was limited options of what you could do, you can do anything. I believe you're leaving later, sir. So you have access to everywhere at the drop of a hat. You can be anywhere. You're connected to everything. You have access to millions of traditions. It's like a supermarket. You can pick. You can go to just down the road. There's another center. There's all kinds of traditions. You have access to so much, right? And then you're in a kind of, I mean, rat race is not the best word, but you're in a constantly stimulated state. You're constantly exposed to stimulus. If you're in a city, you're possibly working. So you also do that during one chunk of your day. And then in the evenings, you might do something else. And so the stimulation that one has in a city, therefore, also changes the dynamic and the approach of a person when they come to a center. And in that, considering, taking all of this into consideration, that's why I thought maybe doing this topic might be helpful, which is Dharma a hobby? Because again, in a center, which is in a city, or people are like, I'm also from Delhi, so this is, I also consider myself part of this, right? When we grow up or when we live in a certain place, you do things, but they don't necessarily become part of your life. You do things on the side. You have your life, you have your job, you have your profession, and then you do stuff on the side. So that could be a sport, that could be a spiritual practice. You might go from one to the other to try and explore different things. You tend to do that when things are not going very well, or someone tells you to come. So there's a whole lot of reasons why you approach something outside of your life. So there's life, and then on the side, there is some other activity. And amongst all these activities, there can be Buddhism, there can be some version of Hinduism, it could be Vedanta, or it could be any other thing. And so when you do it in that way, it's very easy for you to compartmentalize Buddhism or Dharma or practicing Dharma as something which is additional or secondary to life. And so that was the issue that we faced, I think, when we spoke. And it's not, I don't think it's pertinent only to Delhi, it's pertinent to pretty much the whole world. And however, the references in Delhi are easy for me to address. So at least we can do that. That's what I'm going to try and do. But if it's okay, I would rather have this more in terms of a dialogue eventually. So if in between you would like to interject, please feel free to. And then maybe we can keep a chunk later if you can just remind me. Just to open it up and just talk about it more than anything else. Okay, great. Yeah. So what I want you to consider, from like how I would like you to see me, is I'm just someone who's on that side. Like, there's no difference. The only thing is, for some reason, I did a deep dive in Buddhist studies, right? So I've done a deep dive and I'm back here. So I kind of went off for a long time and then now I'm back here. So you please consider, don't consider me as somebody who has realizations or experiences. There's none of that. I've just done a solid deep dive in another world, and I think I've found certain elements that I wish to share. And also, since this is the first time, I've been trying to see what I can fit, and there's just so much that I would like to share and say, look, this is what's going on when we're talking about Dharma, that I don't know how to also like pack it all into this time that we have. So I'll try my best, okay? The idea, however, so coming back to it, is I would like all of us to consider, and I would like also myself to consider, which I do very much. And ironically, since we've had this chat with Nico about doing this, it's something that I'm doing more frequently every day, which is I'm just trying to consider this. And I'm genuinely concerned or wondering whether I personally think of Dharma as an activity that is done, and it is done in a format. So is it something that you do? If you're doing or practicing Dharma, is the practice of Dharma something that is limited to your morning, your afternoon, your evening? Does it have to come out in either you're reciting mantras, or you're doing visualizations, or you're doing breathing techniques, or you're doing meditations? So when you say, I want to practice the Dharma, the sentence in itself needs to be clear in terms of what is it that you are practicing. So how is the Dharma being understood? And when you say you're practicing the Dharma, what does that mean? And if that's not clear, then it can very easily become another one of the tags that we identify or that we put onto ourselves, that then become very nice conversation starters when we go out and we say, oh yeah, we're Buddhist, I'm exploring this world. This is what they say. Oh yeah, but you know, in that tradition, they say this. How about that? Oh no, but there's also this element. So now I know all of these things. let me make a nice mix. And so now I've got this kind of borrowing from all of these traditions. But I'll do that when it's needed, when life is going well and things are smooth. Then it's okay. Then it kind of takes a back burner in the back of my mind. And then when things go hard, okay, now we come back. What did I learn? How do I get it? How do I appropriate all those things? If that's the idea of Dharma, then I don't think it reflects what the Buddha intended when he said, this is the Dharma, this is what I've discovered. And when he tried to communicate it to us, that communication didn't happen. So we're going very, very basic. Yeah, there's no in-depth thing that we're addressing. The reason why I think, however, this is important to address is when I finished my 10 years of study, and I did them quite rigorously, I must confess, the advice that all my teachers gave me, they said, okay, now you know all of that stuff. Now you need to see if any of that is relevant to you. Okay? Which is a very funny sentence to hear, because when you know an entire world of information and you have kind of lived in that environment where in the monastery, the way we study is we're at it pretty much like, I don't know, 18 hours a day. So you're really, it's just constant. And when you're constantly exposed to something, it almost through osmosis, it becomes part of your being, so to say. But it's more because it's a cultural or it's a situational appropriation. It's not something that you necessarily feel. So you can have a lot of information, you can appropriate that information and identify with it. But that doesn't mean that it has actually penetrated and you say, okay, I need this or I want this. So the first thing that I was told after 10 years of study is, see if it's relevant. Like, how is this relevant to you, right? And that also coincided with COVID. So it was very appropriate, because when then COVID happened and then a lot of things happened during COVID, then realizing that you don't have control or you are just as much susceptible to everything and changes as anyone else in the world suddenly makes you kind of wonder whether there was any purpose to studying or whether there was any benefit, or how am I using everything I've studied, right? So then I was literally handheld by my teachers, and they kind of tried to reveal what the purpose of Dharma is. And that is actually very simple. It's not complicated. It's not, emptiness doesn't have to kick in right away. There's no complicated, philosophical, difficult, abstract concepts. It's actually very, very simple. Okay? But that simplicity, I think, is a fundamental thing, because until that simplicity becomes something that you understand and that you feel emotionally connected to strongly, it will be a hobby. It will be fascinating. In Tibetan, I've heard it being known as, there's a term that they use, which is, it's like intellectual fancy. It's a game for the wise. It can be considered a game for the wise, because there's a lot of metaphysical concepts that are very fascinating, right? And then that, if you get lost in that, like I remember Nico when he said one topic we go to is the view of emptiness through prasangik. I was like, sure, I love that. You put me here, I can do that for 3 hours straight. But it doesn't strike a chord if you're not doing it for a purpose. So before I even start, can you at least tell me, because I'll go on talking, I would like to know how, when you hear the word Dharma and practicing the Dharma, what exactly pops into your mind? I think that's kind of important to know. So does anyone just feel free to voice what you think? But when we say this is the Dharma, what exactly does it mean? What does it mean? No, you have to tell me now. Then we'll get into a question. I will do a discussion phase later, but straight from the beginning, what is it? And you say, this is Dharma. I want to practice Dharma. Is there some idea that comes?
It's a reality that supports you.
Okay.
The truth that supports you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That truth you're practicing for what purpose?
What purpose?
Yeah.
For realization of your selflessness
Okay.
and happiness of others.
Okay. But why does the realization of selflessness, is it relevant?
Why is it?
Why is realization of selflessness relevant?
Because ultimately you want to benefit yourself and others.
Yeah. And that you want to benefit yourself is something that comes as a second step of saying something's wrong with me. That doesn't sound nice, no? I think that doesn't always sound nice. I think that is, so I'm going to bang on this a lot. Huh? The first thing the Buddha said when he came out from Bodh Gaya and he attained Buddhahood and he went to Sarnath, he didn't talk about emptiness. He didn't talk about bodhicitta. He didn't talk about anything. He literally went and sat down and he said, this is all messed up. This is all dukkha. That's the first thing that he said, right? And that then became the driving force for everything after that. If the Buddha decided to start with this, there's probably some utility to it, right? In terms of what he said. Beyond what he said, the first thing that the Buddha realized, which kind of prompted him to leave the palace, was the realization that something's off, right? And this feeling of something being off is not kabhi something has happened, so there is something wrong now. Now we need to find a solution. Then we attain balance and equilibrium. So now we can return to normal life. And then when something goes wrong again, I need to get the tools to be able to deal with it. So then I'll go back to it. If that was what motivated the Buddha, considering all the things he had, he would not make that drastic leap of leaving the palace, right? So not only did he feel that something was wrong, he felt that something was wrong all the time.
All the time.
That something being wrong all the time is the driving force behind it. If we don't feel that something is wrong all the time, then it is going to have to be a hobby. It has to be a hobby. There is no other alternative. I've got shoulder pain, which I actually do, so I'll go to physio. It's fine, great, go back to life. My stomach's upset, I'll do panchakarma. I'll be fine, I'll go back to normal life, right? I'm not feeling well, I'll go to a psychologist, I'll have a chat, I'll come back to status quo, I'll be fine. All of this is all predicated by the fact that only when in moments we feel that something's off, do we then approach a system or something where we're trying to find a solution. The Dharma doesn't come from that space. The Dharma comes from a similar space, but with the realization that if we leave things as they are now, it's always off. Things are always off. That's where this is coming out of, unfortunately. And I think this was so strongly kind of emphasized by my teachers, but then even when I read the text, that it really is the common thread that connects everything. There is nothing that falls out of this. So if anything that we consider to be Buddhist teaching, practice, Dharma, whatever you might call it, is not concerned with this aspect, it's not Dharma. That much has to be clear. Is that clear? Yeah? Like this is a necessary thing that we have to know. Okay? Now again, I think there's two ways to approach it. One way to approach it is we need to know what the Buddha said, right? Then we need to see whether what the Buddha said reflects how we live in our experience. And then if what the Buddha said and our experience coincide, then you are willing to even consider to do what the Buddha said. Because if what the Buddha said, I've understood, but it has no bearing on my life, and my life seems to follow in a very different direction, then what the Buddha said could be good when things are off. But when things are okay, then I don't really need to listen to what the Buddha said, right? So Dharma is good for those moments. Is that okay? Right? So the first thing is to try and understand what the Buddha meant. Then when you understand what the Buddha meant, we need to see whether we go through that. And then only whether what we are going through and what the Buddha said makes sense. So what is he saying to me that's going to fix it, right? Because I'm sure you've all heard this analogy a million times. If a person realizes that they're sick, it doesn't mean that they'll be constantly working at getting better. But somewhere in the back of your mind, you have this inkling that something's not fine. And so you're never going to give up that pursuit, even though every now and then you might take a break, you might rest, you eat a good meal, you go out, you have fun. None of that doesn't get put on the side. But there's something in the back of your mind that's telling you, hey, something's not okay, right? So the first thing the Buddha said when he reached Sarnath and he sat down is, this is not okay. Literally, he said that, okay? Now, the technical thing is, he said, our world, external and internal, is not okay. He said it's dukkha, it has the nature of dukkha, right? Translated as suffering, okay? When he said that, if you don't identify what the Buddha meant as dukkha, then again, your identification of dukkha and what the Buddha said as dukkha, they don't coincide. So then you interpret dukkha however you interpret dukkha, and then you say, okay, so that's what he meant. I'm not going through that right now, so I don't need to practice it right now. I'll go through it in another moment, then I'll take what the Buddha said and let's use that as a tool to see what's going on, right? So the understanding of what the Buddha meant as dukkha then becomes central to this theme, right? Okay. Now it starts getting slightly more technical and slightly more tricky, right? And so I think another very appropriate way to look at it is looking at the Buddha's life itself. And the Buddha's life at the time, I think, could be comparable to like really fun life in Delhi now, or really fun life in, like, can you imagine a life of full opulence, luxury? You get whatever you want. You have all, like in Delhi, you get everything. You can get all the restaurants. You can have all the. I mean, Gurgaon isn't the capital of like alcohol in the whole country. Everyone goes there to stock up. It's right now. I think who's worded it? Yeah, you worded it. It's curated to perfection. Like Delhi right now is at a state, or India also the way it's going is curated at a state where it's so perfect to get lost and immersed in all the fun that's happening that I'm assuming at the time of the Buddha it was similar, no? Like if he was a prince and he was living in a palace and all of that was being done and they were cutting flowers that were rotting so that he would not even be aware that there is decay. It's kind of like what we're going through now, no? Especially outside, isn't this is the nicest sidewalk in all of Delhi, no? Over here with all of this beauty. So there's a level of beauty and aesthetic, just gorgeousness that was not there before. So it's very easy to get lost in all of that. Despite all of this, if you consider that the Buddha looked at all of that and said, hang on, something's not clicking, something's not right, and then he left, we kind of need to put ourselves in the same situation and say, okay, so we've got all of this. It's a lot of fun. What is he saying that is not okay with all of this? That's kind of very natural, right? So what's not okay with where we are at, with what we do and how we do it? That's something that we need to figure out, right? So the reason that they say the Buddha was dissatisfied is because he realized that the things that we engage in and the things that we give so much importance to, and this is standard, is they were, and you've heard this a million times, they were unstable, they were conditioned, they were subject to many forces and interactions, and hence they were not stable. So whatever you might be enjoying, or whatever you might be running away from, or whatever you might be relying on, or like placing your bets on in life to give you satisfaction, is inherently unstable. That was the first realization, right? The first thing that the Buddha spoke of when he spoke of suffering was things are changing. The word is anitya, right? Impermanent. And the last thing that the Buddha spoke of before he passed away was things are impermanent, they're changing. So again, that's the other common thread that you'll find all through everything that the Buddha spoke of. So fine, if things are changing and they're uncertain and untenable, what's wrong? Then the Buddha discovered, and the general teachings say that things that are pleasant are also like that. And so then the next question is, okay, so if I have 5 things and all of those are untenable, then I've kind of exhausted my resources. So in the 80s or in the 90s in Delhi, there's only so much fun that you could have. If you think all of that is untenable, then sure, let's go. Let's come and listen to some teaching about what do we do now, because we've exhausted our options. Now there's no exhaustion of options. There's a 6th, there's a 7th, there's an 8th, there's a 10th, there's thousands of things. So, okay, this is not working. It's temporal, fine. When this ends, I move on to the next one. That's exhausted. I move on to the next one. There's an abundance of choice. What's wrong with all of that, right? And that's kind of how we also work. I'm assuming most of us work on that premise. Do we? Like you have fun in one thing, that runs its course. Then you move on to the next one. That runs its course. Earlier, you could do that till your 40s. Now you can do it till your 70s. I've met people who are 50 and they look like they're 30. So like, there's just a general lifespan and a certain stage of health and well-being that allows you to keep enjoying stuff and flitting from one thing to the next because there's so much, right? So if things are untenable and therefore the joy that I derive from them is untenable, there isn't really any issue if I can keep substituting one thing for another thing, technically. And if my situation permits me that luxury, all the more reason for me to go ahead and do it. If it doesn't permit me that luxury, then let me practice Dharma. Because now I don't get to do what the people who can have fun all the time do, so I need to find a substitute. But actually, if I could have fun like they are having fun all the time, then I really won't come to practice or Tushita for anything. Like you don't need it. Actually, if that's your view, you don't need any of this, right? So again, maybe one could say, well, at the time of the Buddha, they didn't have so much fun stuff to do. It was limited because they didn't have so much innovation. So had the Buddha had more things, maybe he would have left the palace later. I don't know. But the point was not even that. The Buddha said, no, that's not what it is. The fact that it's untenable and the fact that it's uncertain is accompanied with a mistaken perception of what it is. So very quickly the teachings of the Buddha, they go from not only are things untenable, what makes them difficult or what creates the problems is not that they're untenable. It's the fact that we don't get it. That's the first one, right? So the first thing that the Buddha is trying to introduce to us is things are not stable, they're not tenable, they're changing, they're impermanent. They're going to be constantly under the influence of something else. And so you really have nothing that you can like place your bet on and expect it to pan out the way you want it to happen. And that is fine. That's just how it is. Where the problem is you don't get it. That's what the first point was, right? So as the story goes, when the Buddha was sitting in Sarnath, he said, this is the truth of suffering. Then he said, these are the causes, etc., etc. When he said, this is the truth of suffering, he said, know that this is the truth of suffering, right? And the first hint that he gave was, he said, know that this is the truth of suffering because this is changing. It's anitya. It's impermanent. So the things that we rely on are fragile, they are uncertain, they are untenable. Our assumption is that that's not the case. And by assumption, we don't mean our actual reasoned thinking. It means our default setting, right? So if your base setting doesn't get this information or it doesn't have this worldview, then your base setting will be one that assumes that everything is going to give you some sort of lasting stability or some sort of lasting joy or some lasting discomfort. And that then has an emotional response. That's kind of where we're at. Is that okay? Yeah? Please tell me if it's not. You have to tell me immediately. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah.
The cycles of sunset and sunrise are kind of fixed.
They are fixed, but they don't last the whole time, right? Every cycle, the idea that the Buddha had was that every cycle, and the reason that he gave for this is everything that happens, if you are noticing that it happens as influenced by something else, then that thing's duration or that thing's nature is not going to last. Now, whether it is the physical world or it is the psychological mental world, the underlying assumption is that these two things function in analogous ways. They are time bound, they are temporal, they are subject to change, and therefore if you rely on them too much, they won't work out. So the cycles are, they're recurring, but they're recurring and they only have a certain duration, right? That's why, for instance, for me, dusk is the worst hour of the day. I remember when I used to play in Sirifort. In the evening after football ended, I used to go home at the Chirag Delhi flyover. It always used to be dusk. And the fact that night was coming and that day was ending and that high from having played was ending, every day accompanied with a slight melancholic feeling of unhappiness or some sort of sadness. And the next morning when the sun would come up, there was returning to go and do the same activities again. So there's just this cyclical kind of thing which never really lasts. And that wanting to, and not realizing that that's how it is, at least was identified as the first problem by the Buddha. Does that kind of work? We have to tie it up though, huh?
The process does last.
Please wait.
So the process does last, but what's happening in the moment, if you look at it temporally, like then it doesn't last.
Yeah. So there is a process that's happening. The fact that you're calling it a process itself suggests that it's going through some sort of stages, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that it's going through stages, as long as those stages are working the way you want, it's great. But it's still going through those stages. That was kind of the first discovery that he made. That things are going through stages. You can call it stages. You can say they're temporal. You can use whatever word you want. But the idea is that they're undergoing some states. Yeah, states, manifestations, aspects. There's so many ways that you can refer to that, right? So this was like the first insight that he had that said, this is what's going on. You're not getting that it's going on. That was the main issue that he had, okay? So then, the point here that he tried to make, or that we tried to make in the teachings is, from that nature which is unstable, untenable, and constantly going through those states, there's generally going to be two kinds of states. There's going to be states that you find favorable, and there's going to be states that you are not so fond of, right? The issue out of these two was the ones that are favorable, you kind of get hung up on them in a more colloquial sense. In a technical sense, you have attachment to them, or you have lobha or rag towards them, right? You have this kind of wanting to possess them, or you want to appropriate those things. That was the next step. So things are like that, things are changing, things are undergoing decay, things are undergoing all of this. You're not aware of it, and you're not being aware of it leads you to rely on it too much. That reliance on it is a kind of mental movement, right? It's a form of latching onto something. And the fact that you latch onto it was what the Buddha then said was the next step. That's not okay. The fact that it's doing this is fine. That's just a natural process. The problem is that you're unaware of it. And in that state of unawareness or ignorance, which then starts to sound like Buddhist jargon, you latch onto it. And that latching onto it is a problem. That was the next thing that he identified, right? Is that okay? Yeah, sir.
When we're talking about the,
So could you just please, I think for the online thing that needs that.
when we're talking about the sun and the moon or whatever planets and the stars, I'm like, they're also impermanent. The only
Yeah.
thing is that they have a much bigger lifespan. But in any case, they are also going to be, not be there maybe after a million years or a billion years. So that is just what I wanted to say.
No, I totally agree with you, sir. But I think now what I was saying was this kind of the story as it's being woven is not just talking about things and our experience, it's relating the two. So it's talking about how does the world exist that we experience and how do we experience it. So it's an interplay of our world and our role in engaging with it. And that's where the problem is being identified. So what you're saying is absolutely true, sir.
No, but does that mean I have to be conscious about it all the time, that
So
things are impermanent? I'm like, including the physical world and everything. Of course, I am impermanent in any case. So, but do I have to be conscious about it all the time?
So, sir, I think, one very beautiful thing is, I think technically the answer to that is going to be, you will do what you will do. Whatever you do is a personal decision. The idea that is being tried to explain, that the idea that is being conveyed is, what happens if you're not aware of it all the time? Where do you slip up?
No, I totally caught on what you were saying. That is because I'm not aware. I'm like my day-to-day activities, even otherwise also, I'm not aware about the impermanence.
Yeah.
And I'm caught up in my own self.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what happens when you are not aware? That's kind of the main thing, right? And what the Buddha said is, when you're not aware, what slips in very naturally, effortlessly, insidiously, almost like you don't know it's happening, is this kind of relying on it. You just latch onto it, right? That is known as attachment. That is something that then was the next step, which is wrong. But it's also important for all of us to keep in mind that this is common to all traditions in India. This is not some great discovery that was made only by the Buddha. Up until here, we're in a very common space. This is not something that is unique up until here. Okay?
So probably that is why the Buddhists, they have this thing about the death meditation to, meditate upon your own death.
Of course, but that's just a reminder. That's to remind yourself of these things. Exactly, sir.
Right,
exactly.
right.
Yeah, exactly. But that also is not unique to the Buddhists, sir.
I see. Okay.
That's not unique to the Buddhists.
I didn't know about that.
This is very common. I think even the Christians, actually, when they go and they sit in their caves and they contemplate for years, the Christians also have a lot of these meditations.
I see. Okay.
So we're trying to come from... Fathers. Yeah, the Desert Fathers, exactly. They have these things. Okay. So we're trying to... What I'm trying to at least share with you is, there's an entire process that we study when we study these things, and you're led along a certain path. And then at a point, then His Holiness says, there comes a point when you are really dealing with in Tibetan they say Shakti, which means like fact. But it means it's like the heart of the teachings of the Buddha. But before you get to the heart, these are necessary processes that you have to go through if you want to understand the relevance of it. Because otherwise, you give the final result now, and then you don't appreciate the value or the utility of it, and it just sounds like a very fascinating metaphysical idea. So how you're trying to make this relevant or practical in your life is by these kind of step-by-step procedures. And this is also how everyone who practices then proceeds. It's a very standard kind of format. Okay. It's very standard. Okay. So up till here, are we okay till here at this point?
Fine.
Yeah? Okay.
I have a question. So why should am I audible?
Yes.
So why should we be affected if things are impermanent? Like For example, if your life or your age is progressing, like why would I be worried? We can take it as a natural process of life where we age and we get sick and we die. So why should we be affected by it? Why should we uh, think of it as something wrong?
I think it's not so much a question of why should we be affected by it. The question is, are you affected by it? I think that's more the issue over here. So the issue is, again, I think another thing that is very helpful to keep in mind, and this is why there's always so much other stuff that I think needs to be added, is the teachings of the Buddha are not prescriptive. So there is never going to be an issue of you should do, you should not do, aisa karna hai, aisa nahi karna hai. There's none of that. This should do, shouldn't do is a kind of, it almost starts being someone telling you that this is the right thing to do. If that's your approach and that's your thinking, then again you'll be like, well, I don't like what you're saying. Why should I listen to you? So the idea here is you're trying to generate that understanding in yourself, and the understanding or the question is, does that create problems? The fact that this is nature and this is how nature is that creating issues? So the fact that we rely frequently on states that don't last, does that create an issue? Should it is another issue. Of course it shouldn't. In an ideal world it shouldn't. But does it? And the idea that
Maybe
it does or not,
maybe for some time it does, and then we get over it and we get
Precisely. That's totally fine. It lasts for a bit and then it goes bad again, and then it happens again and then it goes bad again, right? That's kind of the general process. Yeah? And we're just coming to that. Perfect. That's perfect, actually. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. Then, if that's the case, then why do you constantly try without making any effort? Why do you constantly fall on or latch on or commit to things that are not going to be sustainable, that are not going to be lasting, that are not going to be making your life particularly good? You know that that's not going to happen. In retrospect, everyone knows that this is how it is, right? It's always a post recollection state. You always wonder in later and you say, aisa, this should have not happened. But in the heat of the moment, what makes you commit to it? And the fact that you're committing is not happening with any effort. It's effortless, right? Is it? Is there any effort involved in committing to things that you think are nice or wanting to have things? There's no effort behind it, right? And so
it's spontaneous.
It's totally spontaneous. And so Sandeepji, this is the thing. It's spontaneous. You do it, it lasts for a while, it stops. Then you do it again, it lasts for a while, it stops. Now the next observation was, where is all of this constant relying and making the same mistake coming from? Why are you doing this again and again and again and again and again? Right? And the idea, sorry?
For pleasure.
For pleasure, but when you do it and then later you notice that it doesn't give you lasting pleasure, you do it again. And then you know that it's not giving you pleasure and you do it again. So if it was for pleasure and it's not done its job many times, why do you keep doing it again? That's kind of the idea.
Whatever amount of time it gives me the pleasure, I do it, and then I again yearn for it.
Exactly, right? That's exactly how we do. That's what we're saying. So that was before. And now in Delhi, you can do this endlessly because you'll find a million different ways to give you pleasure, always at different heightened levels. So when I come down from the mountains, the fact that I can eat at Vietnam and eat at all of these great places, it makes my life really great because I can have really great Vietnamese food, which was not allowed before. And when I'm tired of that flavor profile, great, we'll move on to another one. Then we move on to another one. And then we go to Moti Bagh and we'll have Dal Makhni because that's that. No, Moti Mahal. And we'll go to the original one, not the fake one, right? So we have all of this because theirs is better than the next one. So we can keep making this, no? We keep heightening it. But the idea here is this drive that's making you commit. You were saying something? Yeah, please.
So what is the link between our true nature and Sukh?
That is much later. It has to end there. But again, why I'm doing it like this, no, sir, is because that question, if it's discussed right away, the relevance in everyday life might be difficult to connect the dots between these two things, because my real nature and Sukh then sometimes can become a metaphysical concept. And if it's a metaphysical concept in a setting like this, which is controlled in a beautiful place with the AC where we can all have this discussion, it works. But then when I go outside, it's gone. There's that danger. Whereas if you come to that at the end of this, trying to make it relevant to your life, then that question of my real nature and what actually gives me happiness will become a burning wish. And that will be the same attitude that someone who has a very serious medical condition has in wanting to get better. That's why this is the general process in which things are taught. Now, the reason again why we're doing this is, like the other suggestion that Nico had was, let's discuss emptiness. Emptiness is ultimate nature. It's a fascinating concept. It's my favorite thing. It's what I did my dissertation on also. So personally, it's the thing that interests me the most. But that is an argument that, if it's not contextualized, can be completely irrelevant. So we have to get there, but let's do it in a different order is my only suggestion. Is that okay? Yeah. So then when the time comes, then please bring that up again. I'll be more than happy if we can figure it out. Yeah.
Are we finding permanence in Sukh?
Again,
Okay, ठीक.
the same. You're coming to the same thing, but you're coming exactly to the same. It's on page 2. I'm on page 1. That's definitely, it's written there. It actually says that. Yeah. Okay. So here, I'm on page 2 actually. So yeah, I think here. So the idea is, if this is the situation, if this is what we're doing, and we're constantly falling prey to this, I think it's quite fair to say that it's a behavioral pattern. There's something behaviorally wrong with us, using a little bit modern terminology, no? There's just a weird behavioral pattern that we have that just keeps making you do the same thing again and again and again, right? I think it's the same attitude that anyone who is addicted to anything has, to substances has, whatever it is. It's just a behavioral pattern, right? The next thing that then was addressed was, is this behavioral pattern so entrenched in us that it's just governing and coloring and tainting everything that we do? That's a very important issue over here. And so the answer to this that the Buddha says is, yes, every waking, sleeping state is tainted by this distorted, wrong behavioral pattern. And the proof is in the pudding, where if you are subjected to stimulus, you act like that. So, you know, when you have a certain kind of trauma, you just need the stimulus, and without any effect, you react like that, right? You've all heard this a million times. I'm petrified of flying. You just need to put a plane in front of me and that tunnel that leads you into the plane, and it's on. So I have like a little anti-anxiety pill that I take to not freak out on a plane. So that habit and that reaction and response time, if it's so fast, so effortless, it suggests that that's a relatively deeply entrenched behavioral pattern. That's kind of quite, I think it's not so hard to figure out, right? So is the behavioral pattern that makes you repeatedly commit to things that gives you unwanted results, is that happening under your control, with your direction, or is this just something that's kind of just happening? Is it just an endless, continuous, uninterrupted happening? And that, the Buddha said, was, that's your state. That's why it's dukkha. And yesterday, we were at this conference in Bangalore, and there was a very lovely Sanskrit professor who gave an etymology. Apparently, the etymology of the word dukkha means like a constriction of space. Sukha means an expansion of space, just linguistically, etymologically. So the fact of a constriction of space means that you are limited to a certain way of being, and that way of being is really stuck deep inside you. So the basic funda, or the basic point is, if that is your base state, then you can do whatever you want. Things will never be good. So when the Buddha sat down and he said, that's what the truth of suffering is, this is what dukkha is, no suffering, this is what he meant. He said, our state, our base state right now is 100% completely and entirely governed by this kind of behavioral problem, for lack of a better word. Is that okay? Yeah.
Why we run behind? Sir, why we run behind only? Why we need sukha, not dukha? What is the pleasure that we get from sukha and our true nature are same?
So again, you're going to this sukha and true nature. I see that that's a very pressing issue, but can we do that in a little bit? I'll tell you why. So that is at page 2. almost at the end. This is still thoda upar. But I'll tell you why I'm saying this. The reason is, the general statement that you'll hear again and again is, it is very natural for you to be drawn to pleasure and to be averse to suffering. Whether you consciously do it or not is another issue. Why you do it or not is another issue. Is that how you are programmed? Is that how everyone is kind of programmed? We're looking at only that aspect right now. Then whether there is a
Nature
different...
design.
Sorry?
Nature design as like...
So that's our design right now, right? Now, in that design, what is being said, at least what the Buddha is trying to say, is in that design, there is another thing that seems to be in the design. There's like a virus in the system. And the virus in the system is, despite you wanting to be happy, somehow something propels you to continuously do things that will not make you happy. Or if they make you happy for a while, and then that doesn't last, and then it makes you latch on to something else. That also seems to be part of the system. Nature seems to have made it like that. And that's more or less everyone's state. That's what is being said so far. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. Is that kind of okay?
We are all sadists.
Pretty much, yeah. Literally. That's kind of what it is, yeah. Masochists. Not. Okay? Fine? That's what he said. Now he said, why you do this, and again, this is very common to Indian themes, right? Why you do this is because there's something that's preventing you from seeing it. And what's preventing you from seeing it is that things are not stable. So now, for us, this is what the Buddha said, we need to check if this is the case. And the point over here is, every time you commit to something, every time you want something, is that accompanied with an assumption or an underlying feeling that you can control it and that it's going to be giving you what you want? Is that kind of an underlying assumption that always accompanies these things? And the Buddha said, yes, that is an underlying assumption that accompanies all of your actions, always. There's no moment when it doesn't. Yeah? Is that okay? Yes.
So does this mean, I'm like... So what you were saying, what I could understand was that that means we are always trying to run after sukha. Is that it? I'm like,
yeah, that is why we're getting it wrong. Not only are we trying to run after it, we're also getting it wrong. We're identifying it incorrectly, and we're placing all our eggs in a basket where there is no real sukha.
Okay, so basically, like not being able to see the reality in that sense,
yeah.
or...
So not seeing the reality is what's leading you to do this. That's what's being said.
Okay.
Yeah, does that make sense?
Well, a little, I wouldn't say. I'm still not very clear about it.
Okay, so please ask everything. Let's try and get as clear as possible.
What exactly, going back to your statement which you just made, running after certain, do I now go to the Vedanta or something where we are talking about the desires? Is it the desires which drive us on, or what?
So do one thing, just for the next 35 minutes. Let's leave all traditions aside.
Okay, fine.
Buddhist, Vedanta, it doesn't matter.
Okay, but
we're just having a discussion as like when the Buddha came and sat in Sarnath, there was no Buddhism.
Yeah.
This is what he said, right? So it's tradition free right now. Let's just look at it for what it is. And this is just an impulse. Is that the kind of impulse that we have? Is the impulse that we find something nice, we want to latch on to it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all we're looking at right now.
So not being able to see that,
so
it's not going to give a permanent thing.
The Buddha is basically saying when you're latching onto that thing, what's making you latch onto it is the fact that you assume that this is going to be some real source of your benefit, some source of joy.
Okay.
That itself is mistaken. That's what he's saying. That's one thing that he says. We're testing whether it's true then is another moment. But this is all he said so far. Yeah?
All right. Fine.
Okay? Yeah?
Fine. Thank
now
you.
This, up until here, we said this is also common to all the traditions. Right? The next thing that the Buddha said, and now this is the most tricky part. This is where it becomes very Buddhist now. Now it becomes the fact of the Buddhist teachings, or like the heart, the real essence of the Buddhist teachings. This fact that you rely on things and you constantly latch onto them endlessly. Actually, but before we do this, the fact that you're constantly doing this and creating this pattern is the fact that the nature of it is suffering, or the nature of it is dukkha. Is that clear? So dukkha means this is your state. The fact that this is your state is because of a behavioral pattern. It's because you have not cultivated, but because you have just kind of been exposed to this state, and this is just perpetuating itself endlessly, right? That's the second wala, that there are causes to this kind of suffering. So this suffering is not someone else's doing, it's just this kind of mistaken psychological state that you just keep perpetuating itself endlessly. And it's reached to such a point that it's so laden and it's so charged in our way of living that it requires no effort to express itself. That's the kind of state that's there. Is that clear? Can you have the, one sec, before, do you know the analogy of being fettered and tied by your habits and karma? Have you heard of all of these things? You must have heard of this analogy, right? That's what this means. The fetters mean that it allows you no wiggle room. Your habits are so entrenched that it allows you no wiggle room currently. That's what the fetter analogy is. So when they say you're being bound by the ropes of karma, it means that your habits are so strong that you're like in a straitjacket. You can't get out of it. That's what is being said. Yeah. Can you just take that thing, sir?
Sorry.
No.
If I keep jumping from one thing to another, from dal makhni to Vietnamese to Myanmarese cuisine and to another cuisine, then there is no sadness, right? To be followed.
You would think so, right? You would think so. That's exactly my point. That's why we're doing this. That's why we're saying, is it a hobby? Because right now, when will you consider dharma? You know that one day when you go to the restaurant and the chef wasn't there and you went at 4 o'clock, so the sous chef was cooking you lunch and it didn't taste good. That day you're like, kuch to galat hai. Like things are not always good. Now there might be something to it. Let me go and explore. But if you're constantly on a high, there's no space for this to creep in, right?
But then you typically just go for a walk in the park or...
Exactly. And so if that's the case, then all of this becomes insignificant. That's precisely why I'm starting from there. And the Buddha must have lived a life like that because he was a prince in a very beautiful place. And all of those descriptions of the palace and all suggest that he was living in that kind of state, right? But still something propelled him to go and say, I think there's something off. And the thing that he discovered is off is his mind. He said, my mind, as it stands today, is too overwhelmed by these completely warped, uncontrolled, overpowering mental states that keep propelling me in one thing and then onto another thing and then onto another thing. But there's also a little point that we need to make. The other thing that he also realized was when you rely on something too much, the second that goes away or the second someone tries to take it away from you, it generates a form of irritation. It generates a form of discontent. It leads to what is technically known as aversion, or not anger, but the impulse of wanting to distance yourself from something that is obstructing your joy or something that is coming in the way of your happiness. Now that can happen because the thing itself is ending, like dusk for me when I'm going home, because you can't play at night. They didn't have night lights, and also you get tired. When things are ending, when that gets taken away from you, there's a other movement. The movement is of slight discontent, right? Or someone comes and obstructs it, then that also leads to irritation. You get a call and you have to leave when you're having a good time, no one's happy about it. Someone has promised you a great day, something comes in the way and blocks you, nothing great. So when you're experiencing something pleasant, you're latching onto it has also the byproduct of when that thing goes away or is being taken away, you want to react, you want to retort. So you have these two kinds of movements, right? One is latching onto things and one is wanting to get away from things. The getting away from is heightened by the latching onto it. This is known as attachment. This is known as aversion.
And if you can just with like a you gave a lot of analogies and example, but like I'm still struggling a bit to understand which exact behavior pattern you're talking about, because there are multiple here.
I'm talking about the two base ones. The two base ones are, okay, thank you. So to make it very clear, when something nice happens, you want to own it. The feeling and the thing that is generating that feeling. You want to keep it. When something unpleasant happens, you want to get away from it. We're talking about two very base things. It's a going towards and a going away from. That then can turn into various manifestations. But this is just the initial two. Is that okay?
So like my behavior pattern of finding an alternate when my favorite restaurant is closed to go for a walk in the park, where does that fit?
That fits into what you tell me. Is there a state of discontent and not being able to get that?
Probably, yeah.
Does that propel
Probably
you in
that's
another
what
direction?
initiated it.
Does that propel you in another direction?
But it's not latching on to something.
No, so the latching on is the wanting. The other one is wanting to get away from. So the latching on is the attachment, and the other one is wanting to distance. That wanting to distance has then moved you onto something else.
So let's just call it wanting rather than latching on.
हाँ ठीक है sure wanting latching I have no problem with the semantics I at some point words started becoming very interchangeable, so whatever you want to use. I'm talking about more, think of it more as like a motion of wanting and a motion of not wanting. Right, just go like that. Maybe latching is not the right word. No problem at all. Is that okay?
So even within that habit pattern of skillfully finding a alternative,
you're saying that's skillful. Here they're saying it's not skillful.
Even within that, both of them occur.
That same thing is happening. Right? Okay. Now, is that clear so far? So far the Buddha has said, and this is your base state always. That's why something is going to always go wrong. Now the next thing he said is, this is coming from mistaken ideas. Also, it's a behavioral error, or it's a cognitive error, or it's a perceptive error. Is that okay? The perceptive error is dual. One is you think that things are stable, and the more dangerous one, which now is the really tricky one, and now it's the heart of the thing, is you feel like you have some autonomous agency over all of these things. That's the real, like when you get into the Buddhist one, that's where it gets into strict, clear Buddhist ideas. Is that okay? So the idea is you are an agent, and by agent it means you are the doer who does things, but you have a sense of autonomous agency where you can manipulate and bend things to your will. And with that underlying assumption, when you act and you want something and you don't want something, all of these problems will arise. Now, this is what he said. This is what they've all said after that. This is what you need to see whether it makes sense to you or not. Okay? And a general test that's quite easy is, if you didn't have a notion of agency, and by agency we don't mean that you can't do anything, but autonomously. Autonomously means you do it and it happens, right? Because you can control. If that was not the case, why do we get disappointed when things don't pan out? That's the general test, like the litmus test to see if this is true or not. That's the general test. And the reason that is said is because the assumption, or the underlying assumption, was that you do have this sense of agency. So the Buddhist thing is, you know how you've heard this a million times. Now you can say Anatman or self or true nature. Now you can discuss that, because now the Buddha said, okay, this is all coming from a notion of you as something that has agency over your world. That underlying premise, as long as it is tainting what you do, 100% you'll falter. There's no other option. Yeah.
Does this mean that when we talk about autonomous agency, does this mean, okay, that I'm trying to control things, but a lot of times, or most of the times, things do not pan out the way I want them to.
Yeah.
So are we trying to say that things are not within my control? All of them?
Pretty much.
All of them?
Yeah.
So because I'm not being able to see this, so that is the cause of my problems?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically,
in very lay terms, that's kind of what it is.
Okay.
So, now, does that mean that you don't do anything? No. So these are all the resultant issues that arise. But yeah.
So basically, I just give up control. Is that what we're trying to arrive at?
We're not concerned with where we're supposed to go, what is supposed to be done, what is the right thing to do. We're saying, is this the state that we live in? That's what we're checking right now.
No, of course. I mean, like, we do.
Do you agree with this, sir?
I totally agree.
Do you agree that as long as this is the state, the psychological state that is coloring your experience and your world, you will either want to get away from?
I totally agree with that.
Okay. And do you also agree that then leads to all of the various issues that you find yourself in?
Totally agreed.
So we agree with that. Now we're not concerned with what should we do.
No, I'm not talking about that. The only thing which I was wanting to know, I'm like, whether you are trying to suggest is, when I'm trying to, trying to procure something or trying to seek pleasure, when I do not find that pleasure, and most of the time I'm not able to do it, things don't go my way. So are we trying to say that things are not within my control, all of them? So I just give up control of something of that sort?
So good. So again, is it the give up control thing? No, so the idea here is the fact that things are in constant change, and the fact that things are like that. Now we need to get a little more into the slightly more practice part of it, but the more philosophical part of it. Okay. And the idea over here is, if that is the case, so okay, let's assume for a second that this is true. Okay, let's assume for a second that this is true. If this is true, then the opposite of this is how things really are. So the reality of it is that you don't have control. The reality of it is that you don't have any kind of independent agency where you can just want things and they happen. In that case, what do you do? Right? What do you do? Again, now, what do you do answered from this space is very different from what do you do answered from realizing that this space is the solution to the problem. This is a distinction that we have to make. Because if you talk about it, what do you do from here? It becomes one of those problems that many people have, which is how do you reconcile ethics, morality, and Buddhist philosophy? We're not concerned with that. We're saying, have you come to this point after having seen that whatever difficulty arises in us is coming from this space, and that this space is coming from a mistaken perception, and that this mistaken perception is the kind of mistaken perception which assumes agency, autonomy in an independent, self-sustaining kind of manner? If you come through this space, then your need is different. So your ethical conundrum is not yet going to happen.
But you see, most of the time I don't think like that, as a layman.
Sir, that's why we're doing. Is this a hobby? That's why we're doing this. Because what happens is you will come and you will be often blown away with some kind of great thing, and you're like, wait, how do I use any of this? So this is how the Buddha said one should come to it.
So most of the time I'm like, I think that everything is under my control. I'm like, things should pan out my way.
So this is what the Buddha discovered. The Buddha said, so when the Buddha went out of the palace, the first thing he saw was an old person, and he asked his charioteer, he said, does it have to happen to me? Yes. What that meant was, this is not in your control. Even you, Prince Siddhartha, that's where you're heading. Next thing he saw a sick person, the Buddha said, does that have to happen to me? Yeah. That's also not in your control. Next thing, dead person. Does that have to happen to me? Yeah, not in your control. Then the Buddha saw that ascetic and he said, what's that person doing? Trying to figure out how not to go through all of that. Right? That's kind of how this whole thing happened. So it's so contrary to how you feel that hearing all of these things is, one, sometimes slightly uncomfortable, but also it doesn't resonate right away. So that's why also the thing the Buddha said is, when the Buddha attained Buddhahood, he says, what I've got is too deep, it's too profound. You're not going to get it, so I'm going to the forest. That's the first thing he says after he attains Buddhahood, right? We went to the Buddha and we said, no. What have you got? Come tell us, right? And the reason is because it's so counterintuitive, it's so different from how we think, it's so different from how we act, that having to understand that worldview and assume that you can actually function through that is not easy. So if you feel like that after 1 hour, 5 minutes, I think it's very good. That's kind of the point. So that's the new habit that they're trying to tell you to accustom yourself with. But my suggestion, sir, is don't just take it as another, they have said this, therefore I will do this. Now the next step is this any of this true? That's what we need to figure out.
Yeah,
right?
no, you see, this debate would always go on in the mind, whether the control is there, whether I can, whether things are happening on their own. I'm like, within my, circumstances, or whether I'm making them happen.
Yeah, so that is one of the things that are here. So the answer here is, it's not in your control. The fact that it's not in your control suggests, and that's fine. But if you assume control, when a good thing happens, you want to kind of own it.
Yeah.
When that thing goes away, because it's not going to last, you will have tension, you will have friction, and so you will want to try and find a way to either retain it or get another one, or get a better one, or go for a walk to kind of clear your mind, or you will get angry with the source of where it has come from. All of these are kind of illusions of grandeur, where you think you are in a way that doesn't reconcile. That was where he came to here. That's what he said. Is that okay?
Yeah. Fine, perfect.
Is that fine for everyone?
Thank you.
Yeah? Okay. Yeah.
is it correct to say that you are not suggesting anything but just building a case?
Precisely. There's no suggestion. You know, the Buddha's favorite statement is monks and scholars like a goldsmith cut. It's not a party line that we use to then come off and say, oh no, we are actually very good critical thinkers, trust us. It's a genuine fact. This is what the Buddha sat down in Bodh Gaya under the Bodhi tree and said, this is what I found. This is how I feel. I've also found an alternative. I'm living in that way, which is an alternative. See if it works for you. Right?
So can we talk for a bit about the litmus test that you mentioned a while back,
Yeah.
and how it we can actually like maybe mentally do it relating to our own life, not Buddha seeing someone.
Oh, okay. That's yeah. Can we do one thing? We have 17 minutes, and we don't have all night. We have 7. Yeah, you have to leave. Okay, right? So no, what my point was that is actually very important. But I think what I'd like to do today is just do the. I know it doesn't sound so much fun, but the information part. I think there's a completion to this information, because often the complaint that many people have is Buddhism is a very like life negating, or it's a very pessimistic tradition where they say you are messed up, you are in a bad state, and then they like bounce and they're like bye, peace out, do your thing.
You enter into a retreat happily and leave understanding
And then we
everything
leave.
is dukkha.
Exactly. That's not where I want to end it, because that's a big complaint I've heard. I was in Dharamshala once and there was a discussion about life affirming and life negating traditions, and Buddhism was put in life negating. So I walked in and I was like, what do you guys mean? And they said, oh yeah, Buddhism says you should not do anything, you should abstain from the world, everything is dukkha, everything is bad. So it's a life negating tradition. So I don't want to do that. I don't want to end it there. So I just want to finish now. Yeah, that's another big thing that it's done, right? Okay. Is that okay? Like, but how you're getting there is the important thing. Is that fine? Are you okay? You've missed your movie? You're fine? Okay, good. Okay. Now, the thing then is, if this is the case, then now we're back at what Dharma is, practicing Dharma. Dharma is a state of mind that doesn't have this misconception. It's often called nirvana, or nirodha is the technical word. Absence. It's not some abstract void entity floating around in the ether. It is the absence of this mental habit. That's all it is. Right? Now, if that is the problem, you want to attain a state that is free of that problem. That's what Dharma is. So if you want to practice the Dharma, this is what you want to get. You want to get a state that is free from this. Is that okay? So if you will now say, I want to practice Dharma, and your identification of Dharma is, I need to come here and do prostrations, or I need to do the water bowls, or I need to do mantras, and I need to do circumambulations and whatever retreats and visualization, that's all fine. But that's not Dharma until it's directed at this. Is that fine? This is really, really important. Because if this is not why you're doing it, you're not doing what the Buddha said. You're doing your own thing, which is fine. But I think it's important to at least get your facts right. Okay? This is what he said. Is that okay? Is that okay? Now, how do you do this? If it is a mistaken idea, then you just have to realize that it's not like that. So it's not even that hard, actually. You don't really need to do all of these other things, right? Okay? You just need to get the realization that it's not like that. And what you were saying. So you do the litmus test on yourself. You sit there and you check whether this is how you function, this is your state of being, whether this is an accurate state of being or it's not an accurate state of being. And when you come to the conclusion, one way or the other, then you will have certainty in whatever conclusion you've come to, right? Now we talk about all the things we do. So when you listen to teachings, you're listening to a teaching that is trying to explain this to you. When you study, you're trying to study something that is explaining this to you. Is this how I perceive the world? Is the way I perceive the world accurate or not? If you're reciting mantras, you recite mantras with the intention of understanding this. If you're doing water bowls, you do it with the intention of understanding this. If you're doing breathing meditation, you're doing it with the intention of cultivating a mind that can sustain this. If you're practicing virtue and non-virtue, you're doing it to sustain this. Anything that is not doing it for this is not technically Dharma. It's not practicing Dharma. So that's what Dharma is. This is how you get to it. This is what practicing it means. Now, all the other stuff that we attribute as Buddhist practice, for lack of a better word, it's frills. Yeah? Many things you can do away with. Because if that was not the case, the Theravadan monks who are very austere in the jungles, they would not be practicing. If it required all of this ritual and all of this stuff, they would not be practicing Dharma. If it required austerity, all the other people would not be practicing Dharma because they're very ritualistic. If it required an abandoning of the world, His Holiness the Dalai Lama would not be practicing Dharma. If it required engagement in the world, Milarepa would not be practicing Dharma. So the problem that we often have is that we see Dharma and the practice of Dharma as some sort of external manifestation or representation of something. The point is, it's not that. It's coming from this burning desire that has identified this and is concerned with this and wants to do this. This cannot be a hobby if you've got it. The reason why it can't be a hobby is because then it's always pestering you. It's always sitting in the back of your mind, and whether you're sitting or you're eating or you're walking or you're driving or you're at work or you're at wherever you are, eating really great food and going to the, what is that, Cyber City food court where they've got all the things. That's what it is, no? It's Cyber Hub, right? Yeah. It's awesome, no? So you can be doing like a food crawl over there at all of these places, but if this is there in the back of your mind, this is always going to be there. So there is no room for separating Dharma and everything else. There is no room for that. So the funny part is the title, Is Dharma a Hobby, is already like a, what's that word? It's a self-contradictory statement. What are they called? Yeah, it's an oxymoron. Yeah, it's a complete oxymoron because Dharma and hobby can't go hand in hand. It's just not, it's not conceivable. But it becomes that when you have a misunderstanding. Yeah, so that's kind of why we picked this subject. Okay, so just a few things I wanted to say because this is what we're very common with. So then what's the whole deal with karma? Why do they say do good things, don't do bad things? Yeah, because if this is your concern and you realize that this is what Dharma is, this is what I need to do to get it, then you need favorable states to be able to do that, no? Like if you're constantly busy, you're constantly occupied and you're constantly getting tortured and troubled by people, you don't have the bandwidth to deal with that. So the virtue is to cultivate states that are favorable to do this. Non-virtue makes it in a way where it's not favorable. Non-virtue means it's just mental turmoil. If you're constantly in mental turmoil, how much are you going to do? You don't have any space to do this, right? So good, bad, virtue, non-virtue is solely to sustain this. Is that okay? Now, samadhi, shamatha, single-pointed concentration. In and of itself, it's not practicing dharma. Is that clear? It's not. Counting your breaths is not in itself practicing dharma. If it is to generate a mind which is calm and clear enough to do this, then it's to practice dharma. Is that okay? Yeah? Being well, livelihood, accumulating, generosity, all of these things are to create conditions that are favorable to do this. Yeah? So I just wrote a whole bunch of them. Now, even the teachings part, coming for here. So if ever you will attend teachings later, which I hope you do, and you go in and you get fascinated by, oh, the Buddhist explanation of generosity is so beautiful, but you come away with no further clarity on this, it's not, you haven't got any Dharma teaching. You've gotten a teaching on generosity, great, it's awesome, but it's not a Dharma teaching because it's not answering this. If you come and you do a teaching on bodhicitta and how to be loving towards everyone, that's great, you should be empathetic and loving towards everyone. But is it coming out of a need for practicing Dharma? No. Then it's not Dharma. Kamalashila himself says bodhicitta without an understanding of selflessness, Acharya Kamalashila says, is nothing, it's not going anywhere. It's just like, it's a touchy-feely version of bodhicitta, no? Where everyone is nice and you love everyone and you don't hate everyone. It's not Dharma. Anything that is not driven or supported or led by this is technically not Dharma. Is that clear? That was all I wish to convey. Yeah? Now, if you get this and you experience this, then the next question is, can it be a hobby? My view is that it really just can't. Yeah? Okay? Is that fine? So I think I'm done. Is there anything that you would like to say or add or, I don't know, any observations? Please.
I just really enjoyed the way you presented the whole thing. I did not doze off at all,
I was
if
impressed.
you
yeah.
noticed.
Could you sleep on the plane now?
But I applaud the clarity that you presented with this. I really enjoyed the talk. That's all I needed to add.
But can I tell you something that I find very funny? Thank you. First, thank you. But what I want to say is, after, like, when we study, we get a cartload of information. We really, really do. Like, we have so much information just jammed in our brain. After this clicks, and this is clicking for me entirely because of my teachers. Like, it's just totally the clarity that they've given me. So I can't really claim any credit for this. But once you get this lens, you literally see that all of that massive information is literally just answering this question. It's quite amazing.
I think that really is terrific. I like the way, I think the ability to distill what you've learned and trickle down things in biteful that a layperson could understand and appreciate. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Right on.
I hope if that happened, that's great, because that's kind of the purpose.
So the nagging feeling that you mentioned here is that the back of your head, right, where you're always thinking, is this I'm in control, or whether this is leading me to sukha or not. But how does this translate to the actual the process or the path to Buddhism? Like, how
So,
would I go from there to practicing Buddhism,
so
like
I
the
think
Dharma?
that's also your question, no? I think not your question, but kind of like the concern, no? Yeah. I'm more excited about that part, no? Yeah, I know. So you know how? Okay, so Sandeepji, come back to the order. The 4 truths were the first thing that the Buddha taught, right? The 4 noble truths.
Yes.
So we've done dukkha, then we've done causes, then there's cessation, which is assuming that it's possible, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The 4th one. Then the Buddha said, this is the path, practice it, right? Now the interesting thing is, when the Buddha said, this is the path, practice it, at that point, then, I don't know, does this make sense to get into it? Yeah. When he said, this is the path, get into it, the path will depend on what you want to do with this kind of understanding. So if you want to make sure that you're out, like you'll be like, I'm out, I don't want this, I want to get out, then you have one path. If your objective is, no, I'm not fine with just being out myself, I want to be out and I want to make sure that all of you are also out, then you have a totally different path. So in terms of what you have to do, it depends a lot on the motivation. But the similarity in the motivation of both people is going to be, I want to get rid of the dukkha, which is coming from the mistaken views that I have, right? And so literally the path is generating the correct view. So it's generating wisdom, it's cultivation of wisdom. There is nothing else to it. Now, when this wisdom is cultivated, the wisdom has to be sustained, and so you do other complementary actions to sustain the wisdom, you understand? Which is all the other things, like samadhi, virtue, mantras, recitations, retreats, all of that is to sustain the cultivation of wisdom. But the wisdom is literally just checking to see whether this underlying assumption is an accurate depiction of reality or not. That's literally all it's doing. Is that okay?
Got it. Yeah, right? Thank you.
Now, if your wish is to take this and make sure that you are free from dukkha and so is everyone else, then you got a longer thing. So there's a lot more info that the Buddha gave. That's known as the Mahayana, or the path to attain not just liberation but also Buddhahood. So all the other are, okay, this is important because when you hear teachings, this is called Tushita Mahayana Meditation Center. Mahayana has been there, no? All the other stuff that is part of Mahayana is not for yourself. If you're only concerned for yourself, you don't need to do that. Is that clear? Right? But if you want to make sure that you are out and you are out, then I'm going to have to start considering all that other stuff as well. There's no other option. Now that is another discussion entirely in itself, right? So that's why you have to pick which one you want. How do you feel? This is a question of intention. Yeah? There's another one, but yeah, I don't know. That's some stuff.
Maybe Bhavanila and then Mark.
Yeah, Bhavani.
Hello, Atisha. So nice to listen to a live session after so many years. My question was maybe a naive one. Just wanted to understand when the Buddha was surrounded by luxury, so where did he feel the discontent while experiencing that luxury or after he saw the three sights?
I think the story goes, I don't know, I've heard so many stories. One of them is, I believe, that he saw, one version is that he saw a drooping flower in the garden and he saw that things are not always beautiful. And another version that I heard is that he saw the courtesans at night who were sleeping, you know, with the ugly sleeping faces. And that was another one that triggered it. But it's all before he left the palace, because the feeling of something being off happened before he left the palace, which is when he requested his father to be able to leave. Right?
And so there's
So,
something, sorry.
no.
So I'm
You,
just curious because I wanted to understand there's something in the nature of, there's something off in being surrounded by excessive happiness, right? In the material sense. So that triggered him to seek what reality was, what that was off, right?
yeah. But I think, I also wonder, I don't know. I mean, I don't have excessive happiness all the time. So I really don't know how to explain who someone is like blissing out all the time. But even when you have that, you probably have cycles of it, right? And you probably notice that there's always going to be a time when it ends and you don't want it to end. And so you have a party, then you have an after party, and then you have an after party. You still have to go to sleep at some point, right? So when you'd have to go to sleep, you're like, I have to end. So even in extreme joy, the fact that its nature is temporal, I think will always suggest at some point, if you're smart enough to pick up on it, that at some point it's going to come to an end, and that will always lead to some sort of empty feeling or some kind of not wanting to leave. Like people who will have, it's 6 in the morning and they still are like, let's go and do something. Like you just can't let it go. So I think that's just inherent in the experience of things. Maybe that could have also just been a stimulating factor. I really don't know the exact detail of what the Buddha's life says, but whatever is good and however nice it is, it's never endlessly sustained. It just can't be, right?
Thank you.
Atisha, I have a personal question. All your studies and your experience, how did it help you when you had to face the situation of your father?
With dad, yeah. Actually, so just for context, my father passed away during COVID in Delhi, actually, and it was a very ugly kind of, the way he passed was very ugly. And of course, we had a lot of kind of family collapse after that. No, there've been many issues between all of us, as it's expected. But by then, it had been a year, and I had already had COVID had happened, and I had gone through this like tinnitus came. And tinnitus came, and then somehow, I don't know, it was like a collection of things, but then I went into like hectic depression, really, really hectic. And at that point, all the information just kind of went out of the window. And I had Gen in Dharamshala, and Gen was just giving me these kind of little nuggets, which were impermanence, Dukkha, this is how it is. And he kind of like distilled it and essentialized it so much that I would like to believe that that's kind of what sustained me. So by the time dad was in hospital and dad passed away, I genuinely feel I saw it as it was horrible because his decline was really, really bad. But it felt like a process. Like it happened. It was like an event, an occurrence. And it wasn't, I don't know, it wasn't really as horrible. My reaction to it wasn't as horrible as I would have expected it to be. And I don't know why exactly what it was. The only thing that I can assume might have been was these kind of 2 years prior to it, where everything else kind of, I just had to reconsider everything. And I really had to essentialize and for the time being drop everything that I had studied. Not everything, but lots of complicated concepts. I had to put them in the back and focus on the essential things. And then the other things also all tied in. So my reaction to dad passing was, oftentimes I feel bad because I feel like I was not emotionally invested in it almost. Like I feel like I should have been more upset by the whole thing. But then I remember hearing one of my teachers saying, oh yeah, Atisha, he studied some Dharma, he'll be okay. And that kind of made me feel that maybe I'm delusional and 5 years down the line I'll collapse, I don't know. But as it stands today, I think I kind of saw it more as it was a very unfortunate process, but it was like that. Yeah. Very strange. That always stays with me as, was that a right way to react or a bad way to react? But the emotional upheaval wasn't as bad as I would have expected considering how it was playing out. Yeah. Strange.
Markla?
Yeah. I know all of these people. Mark.
Thanks, Atisha. I'm not sure this question is the right one after you just shared, so I appreciate that. Could we say that for people who have very little contact with Dharma, Dharma being a hobby is a step towards it not being a hobby?
I think so, of course. Everything is a step towards it. But the fear that I have, and I think also the fear that Nico had, is you can still be surrounded by Dharma and teachings for a good 4, 5, 6 decades, and you still do it like it's a hobby. It's a really frightening thing. And we've seen that a lot. I think we see that a lot. And in the cities, we see that even more.
It's fashionable.
I didn't even want to use that word. Thank you for saying it. It's very fashionable. I mean, especially in the metropolitan cities, it's very fashionable to have a guru and do some sort of sadhana and have some pictures in your house. And it's extremely fashionable. In India, even more so, because it's cultural also, right?
They flaunt it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's definitely a stepping stone, but I think the important thing is at some point you need to make the connection of why you're there, what you're doing, and what you're doing it for. Until all of these things click, then it can stay into the realm of like, then it's like a party thing. No, it's like a discussion. Oh yes, I went to my guru, they gave me this mala, and now I'm chanting this. Sure, fine, why not? But that's what I'm saying. It's a great stepping stone if at some point it clicks. And why we're doing this, amongst various things that many people do, is I really hope it clicks. Because the one takeaway that I have is, if you start asking me the information, I have tons, don't worry, like I can go on. But of all that information, the one that's the real kernel or the real heart is this. If this is clear, then this is the most important takeaway. So if you've been doing this for 5, 6, 7 years, at some point it's going to have to click. Otherwise, you should also know that you're not really doing Dharma. Yeah? Otherwise, yeah, it's fashionable. Okay. Perfect time. Oh, no.
If
Yeah.
I may. Thank you so much. I'm being honest, I've just been very emotional right now because you've, like the other gentleman said, you've just clarified something so beautiful, and it's connected with me. So I understand the thing of, I get the concept, I've been connecting with it for a while. But I think where I struggle with myself is a human emotion. I've lost my brother, and I'm so sorry to hear about your father. So I struggle deeply with his death. And for me, it's like, how do we maneuver the emotion that we constantly struggle with? And, we talk about the attachment and detachment, like you said. Was it okay for me not to be so detached from the fact that this happened? So this is something I'm constantly debating with myself, and I'm struggling with it.
What I've heard or what I've been told, or also in my case, I mean, I had the luxury of having 10 years of complete liberty to devote myself to these things, right? And my parents were very kind because they allowed me that liberty. The fact that we consider these things often happens when you are faced with difficulty. Otherwise, it doesn't really come up. And so when you are in a heightened emotional state, to try and make sense of it and navigate it then is probably hard. But if you can somehow, what I've been told, or what at least happened, is when you are not in that heightened emotional state, and then you can kind of try and make sense of this, then you get a certain perspective that allows you, in retrospect, to understand your emotional state differently. And then when it re-arises, you will have the tools and be equipped to tackle it then. But in the heat of the moment, to try and do all of these things is really, really very, very hard. So I think that's again another thing. Is it a hobby? Was kind of the reason was because the reason we approach these things is often because we face difficulty. And then when the difficulty subsides, then it doesn't matter anymore. But if you do it consistently and you're regularly thinking about it, then it will be like a new view on life, on yourself that you have. And then when you face difficulty or turmoil, then it's easier to tackle it. So I think That's generally what I've heard. And personally, I'm not equipped enough to deal with or be able to offer any suggestions for heightened emotional states, because I suffer them just as much as the next person. But what I know is that previous familiarization manages to very naturally kick in or support oneself then later when things go wrong.
Thank you so much for that clarity. Really helps me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you bless us with a small
Me? No, I
litmus
won't.
test meditation?
I think that's something that we will have to. I can't bless you, no chance.
No,
I can tell you
meditation.
the meditation thing. We should try and do another moment. Will we ever meet again? We should do it though at some point.
So, Atisha, this is just the beginning.
Oh, is it?
We expect you, yes. We expect you to come and teach us on a regular basis.
Right.
Okay?
Move back to
I mean,
Delhi.
see, after you were born, you came here.
Oh my God.
So, nature has committed you to Tushita, okay?
But I think what you're saying is very precious. You know what the thing is? My way of doing it is literally what I've just shared with you. I actually have no other tool. My way of doing it is just sitting there and just seeing if this is all correct. And so my fear also, you know what, ironically, I've never had a guided meditation done, ever. Because a guided meditation, my teachers, they said, if it's a guided meditation, then when someone's not telling you, how are you going to do it yourself? So I've just kind of been familiarized. And so the thing, just to cut it very short, then maybe we can consider something in the future, but you kind of sit there and you see if emotionally what is being said in the teachings is something that resonates with you. That's the litmus test. So when you are experiencing a pleasant state, do you find yourself gravitating to it emotionally in a way where you are so committed to it that extracting yourself from it generates unpleasantness? And when you're faced in an unpleasant and overwhelming situation, do you want to escape it? Just that.
No. Sorry, the litmus test that you mentioned was for accepting that you are.
Oh, that. Yeah. Oh, then we'll have to. Yeah. That. So that will need the reasoning. Because what has to happen there to make that happen is you have to first embody that mistaken perception, and then you have to chip away at it. And in that chipping away at it, then you need to know, at least you have to be somewhat familiar with the reasons that are presented in the teachings of why what you perceive is mistaken. So that then has another entire process, which can be another argument, which is now what I think he had also mentioned, which is the true nature, the selflessness, and that's another entire discussion.
One way you said was to remember how when things didn't go your way, you were sad.
Yeah, but I think what you're asking me is a lot deeper than that. So what you're asking will require some sort of reasoning.
Yeah, and I'm trying to understand how I can take what you said, that small
Yeah.
to there, and probably I can understand. Okay, if it didn't go my way, I was prepared to not be sad, and I had like backups, but I still went sad. So maybe I don't have control over it.
Now you need to then at that point, then the reasoning for selflessness is the only one. Really, it is. It really, really is. It unfortunately, in the entire, you have the first turning, the second turning, the third turning, the only one that's going, I'm assuming, are you familiar with some teachings? Shanti Deva's 9th chapter starts with all of this is for the purpose of wisdom. At some point, after you do all of these things, until you can break that view by generating wisdom through understanding how it really is and all the contradictions that are there in how we perceive the world, you can't really do the litmus test. Right now, it's unfortunately something bad has happened, reflect on it, but it has happened again and you're not equipped with how to break it. That was not included in today's thing.
What made you you as an individual so sure that you are not included?
Just this.
Was there a moment, was it a day like
yeah, when depression kicked in heavily? I was really cruising, man. I was like, oh God, everything was so good. And suddenly from nowhere, the most debilitating thing, I think it was a month and a half of complete insomnia. And then just crash. And I was like, all these things I've learned, all this incredible stuff I've got, all this access to all these teachers, I'm such a blessed individual. Where has this come from? And I still don't know where it came from, frankly. It was just like this upheaval that happened. So I was like, if that's possible, then mine is just all intellectual. now inside, when this happens, how am I going to cope with it or deal with it, then became like a drive. So that's when I realized I was not in control, because it just came from nowhere. It really came from nowhere. I was like 4 years ago.
Like the greatest.
Kind of also.
So thank you,
Thank you
Dr.
so much.
Mathur, Dr. Atisha
How
Mathur.
embarrassing.
So
Thank
please
you.
accept this. And we request you to come back again.
Thank you so much, really. Tushita is very, very precious. I hope I did justice to the first
I'm
one.
sure your parents are very proud of you, and even we are. And I can vouch for the fact that you're a good student.
Okay, thank you. You've heard this. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Should I turn these things off? You'll do it. Okay, good.